Good morning, New Testament survey students. This is Mr. Albers, and today we're going to be talking about interpretations of Revelation, specifically some of the main ways that Christians throughout the past 2,000 some odd years of church history have tried to make sense of the book as a whole. And obviously we're going to be simplifying when we go through this, and we're going to be presenting this rather quickly. Much more could be said, much ink has been spilled and written in addressing this, and so if you are further interested in digging more deeply into different interpretations of Revelation, feel free to come find me, and I have some books that I can recommend or be happy to talk further about this. But we're going to do a brief introduction to that and do a fun little case study to kind of see how this works when we come to a specific passage. And then the rest of class will be given to you to work on your final project. So without anything else, let's dive in. All right, so picking up where we left off in our guided notes, four main interpretations or four main interpretive proposals. Again, this is an oversimplification, but generally speaking, these are the big four. The first one is the preterist. Okay, preterist relates to the English word for past tense, and the preterist believes that Revelation primarily refers to events that occurred within the first century, specifically around the fall of Jerusalem. So, if you recall when we looked at when the book was written, the preterist position was going to say that Revelation was written sometime between, say, 64 and 68. Note, it was written early to predict some of these events. Now, there's a variety of, there's a gradient or a spectrum, we might say here. There are very hard preterists who believe that really everything in the book has already been achieved. There are other preterists that believe that most has been achieved, but that the new creation at the end is still in the future. And there's some who believe that some of the things have happened, but others haven't. And so again, this is an oversimplification, but the preterist position is there. It's not the most common one, especially in this part of the world, but there are people that believe this, and they have reasons for doing that. So if it's interesting to you, again, I could recommend some books. Second option is the historical. The historical interpretation says that Revelation is a symbolic picture of church history. And so the different things didn't necessarily happen in the first century, like the preterists say, but that they represent the unfolding of everything in history after Christ. Now, the trick with the historical view is as more and more history is added, you have to keep adjusting what does something mean, right? Like, does this terrible, force that opposes God's people, does that refer to the Roman Empire? Or, does that refer to the rise of Islam? Or, does that refer to the Mongol hordes? Does that refer to some within the Reformation thought it referred to the Pope? Does it refer to Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin? You get the picture. It's kind of hard to hold that view and really make a whole lot of sense of the book because history is always changing and being updated, as those of you who have taken recently an AP history exam got to experience. So that's the historical view. It's probably the minority amongst all these four, but there are still people who hold to this interpretation. The futurist, and this is probably the most common, again, in our time and place, would say that Revelation primarily explains events that will happen in the future, around the time that Christ comes again and ushers in the end of the world, whatever that looks like, right? And then we could get into whether there's going to be a 7-year tribulation, whether there's a secret rapture, or whether that happens at the beginning or in the middle of the end of the tribulation, and you get all these different views. And we'll look at some timelines tomorrow of some ways that people have understood this. But that's the futurist view. Again, it's probably the most common, but by all means, it's certainly not the only viewpoint. And then last but not least, there's the idealist, right? And the idealist believes that Revelation is a timeless book of symbols, and the symbols are relevant to each generation of the church. And so it explains Revelation as symbols that we might be able to connect them to specific events or specific people, but not only to those events or those people. And again, we'll look at how this plays out when we do our little case study in just a moment. But the preterist, the historical, the futurist, and the idealist are the four main interpretations that the church has held. Now, before we move on, let me just reiterate something we covered when we looked at keys to understanding the book. Whatever view we're going to come out down on, right, and spoiler warning, I'm not just going to come out and tell you what my view is. If you're interested, come ask me. We're going to hold that charitably, right? There's a reason there's a lot of different options here. This is not the easiest book to understand, and so we want to certainly enjoy talking about it, certainly be willing to debate and discuss and to push and pull, but we don't want to be nasty or uncharitable about it. So let's move to our case study. Okay, so we're going to be looking at the beasts of Revelation 12 and 13. And in your notes there, you see that I've focused in on Revelation 13, 1 through 8. But to kind of give you background for that, what I want you to do first is in small groups, I want you to read through Daniel chapter 7 and write down, just maybe one person with their own piece of paper or on the back of your notes packet, one person per group, write down just in bullet points everything you observe about the beasts in Daniel's vision, because that's very much forming the background for Revelation 12 and 13. Recall the first thing we said that's important in understanding Revelation is you've got to know the Old Testament background. So you're going to read that first and take a few minutes to do that. Then, once you've done that, I want you to, in the same groups, read through Revelation 12 and 13, and hopefully you've done that as part of your SRJ reading, and write down the connections you see between what you observed in Daniel 7 and what's going on in Revelation 12 and 13, and start thinking through, okay, how does that inform the way we see this? What does that tell us about what's going on? Okay? So go ahead and pause the video, take a few minutes to do that, and when you have completed that, then resume and we'll talk through very briefly the way some of these different interpretations understand these things. Okay, this is maybe a little blast from the past. You might recall I showed you this image of a woodcut or wood carving in Old Testament when we covered Daniel 7. And remember, Daniel sees these beasts rising out of the sea, right, the place of chaos. Think of like Godzilla emerging from the waters to wreak havoc. And then he sees this lion eagle that represents the kingdom of Babylon. He sees this bear eating 3 ribs, which represents the kingdom of Persia. He sees this leopard with 4 heads and 4 wings, which represents Greece. And then he sees this terrifying 10-horned monster, which represents the Roman Empire. And then, of course, we would be remiss if we didn't mention that the passage immediately jumps to the entrance of the Ancient of Days and his throne with a river of fire issuing from it. And then the Son of Man appears, coming in the clouds, and is given authority and a kingdom that will last forever. And we see that that's referring to Jesus. And then Jesus shows up and identifies himself as the Son of Man more than any other title in the New Testament. And there's so much going on there, right? Hopefully you remember at least a little bit of that from previous reading or from Old Testament. But that's our background here, okay? Hopefully you at least noticed as you were looking at the first few verses of Revelation 13 that the beast that John sees rising out of the sea, there's a connection right there, it has 10 horns, okay, there's another connection, right? 7 heads, 10 diadems on its horn, blasphemous names, and it's like a leopard, a bear, and a lion, right? And so in those first few verses, we've got the 10 horns, we've got the leopard, we've got the bear, and we've got the lion. And oh, look at that. It's composed of the exact same types of animals that Daniel saw rising out of the ocean in Daniel chapter 7. Coincidence? I think not, right? And so there's some major interplay and connections going on here, which should then raise some questions. Okay, well, what did these beasts represent in Daniel's vision? Okay, these were human kingdoms and empires, right, who were ruling the part of the world where God's people were. Okay, so when Daniel sees this, or when John, rather, in Revelation sees this beast that seems to be this amalgamation or this combination, right? It's like the beasts have gotten together and they've come together to form one giant monster. How does that inform the way we understand what that monster is? And it's that question that we will turn to now, because the different interpretations are going to see that in slightly different ways. So let's turn to that, and then we'll wrap up. Okay, so looking at this, the preterist sees the beast as symbolizing the Roman Empire and specifically Nero, right? The end of chapter 13, we get the number of the beast. You might recall from the videos we watched last week introducing Revelation that a very common explanation for that is if you take the words Nero Caesar using the Hebrew spelling of it, and you add up the numeric values for each letter as understood in the ancient world, you get 666, right? And so the preterist would say, yeah, that beast is Nero, like the great persecutor of the church, very evil man with a lot of power who literally took Christians, soaked them in oil, and used them as candles to light his garden parties, right? Great enemy of the church, persecutor of the church, terrible opponent of God, right? First century solution, or first century interpretation, okay? The historical interpretation, well, there's any number of things the beast could symbolize, because as history continues to go on, you have to keep revising that, okay? So the first historical interpretation would say, well, that must be Rome, right? Rome, the Roman Empire is a great persecutor of the church. Well, what happens in the year 325, or rather 312, 313, when Constantine, as emperor, makes Christianity legal and actually announces that he's converted? Well, all of a sudden it's not Rome anymore. Okay, well, maybe it's the rise of Islam in the 7th century, the 600s, where it overran a whole portion of the Eastern Church, and all of a sudden the primary threat to Christians in that part of the world was from Islamic powers, right? During the Reformation, many of the Protestants believed that the Pope, the Roman Catholic Church, was what the beast was, with the Pope at the head, because of the persecution that was happening there. Now, to be fair, you could put the shoe on the other foot, and in places where the Protestants had political control, they didn't always treat the Roman Catholic inhabitants of their land well either, and so you could flip that around and say, well, maybe it's the Protestants who were persecuting the Catholics, and you could go on, and okay, well, what about the 20th century? Is it Hitler? Is Hitler the beast, or is it Stalin, or who knows, right? And again, that's one of the challenges with the historical view, is history is always there's always more of it. The futurist is going to say the beast symbolizes a future Antichrist figure. So if you've read or heard of the Left Behind series, right, the beast represents a specific person who rises to power as the head of eventually a one world government, and gets a fatal wound, but then Satan resurrects. Anyhow, something along those lines, right? The beast is the Antichrist, the future opponent of God's people, who will show up at the end of time to be the great enemy of the church, to persecute them, and will only be taken out when Jesus returns in power. And the idealist is going to look at this passage and say, well, the idealist is almost going to take a little bit from each of these views and say, the beast is kind of all of those. The beast is an ever-present pattern of earthly kingdoms that rise against the kingdom of God. So if you're one of John's readers living in the 1st century, whether John wrote it in the 60s or later, you might read about the beast and say, oh yeah, I know who that is, or what that is. That's the Roman Empire that's persecuting me. If you were reading Revelation in the 7th century, right, and what's now Syria, you might say, oh, I know what that is. That's these Islamic conquerors who are persecuting the church and who are taking over. If you were reading this during the time of the Reformation, you might say, oh, I know who that is. That's whatever political power is oppressing me or is persecuting me because I'm a Christian. Or if you're reading it in the 1930s in Nazi Germany, you might say, oh, I know who that is. That's the Nazi government, right? They're taking over, they're doing all these terrible things, and it goes on, right? Almost like the historical view, except the idealist view is not saying that the beast has to represent one thing. It's saying that the beast represents an idea that more than one person can symbolize or embody, right? So the idealist kind of takes a little bit from each of the other views and sees it that way. A little bit trickier to understand per se, but that's the way that they would read that. So hopefully that was helpful. Again, there's so much more we could talk about this passage. There's plenty of connections, hopefully, that you recognize that we didn't even have time to cover. But that is a very brief introduction to the different ways that Revelation has historically been read. And again, if you are really interested in digging more deeply into this, please feel free to come talk to me or send me a Schoology message. I would be happy to talk with you or to point you in the direction of some resources that would be helpful for you. So with that, you can spend the rest of your class time working on your final project and maybe using some of this information to help you with that. So happy projecting and have a wonderful day.